Hello everyone, welcome to New Now by Manesh and welcome to Transhumanism and the Human Frontier. My name is Anna Kirikova. I'm now in St. Petersburg, Russia, and we have a transcontinental bridge to the USA tonight with our speakers. We are going to talk about transhumanism. So what is transhumanism? Asked a friend of mine just a couple of days ago when I asked her to join the event. And I would like to maybe, illustrate the uncertainty that some people, or probably most of people, have towards this movement or phenomenon, or whatever you call it, with an illustration from a brilliant British TV series called Years and Years that was created and written by also brilliant and amazing Russell T. Davies and produced by BBC and HBO in 2019. So the two protagonists of the show are sitting with their teenage daughter Bethany, and she tells her parents that she's no longer comfortable in her body. Maybe we can have a screenshot now? Yes, thanks. There she is. So teenage Bethany tells her parents that she's no longer comfortable in her body, and that she would like to become trans. Well, her parents think of this as very cool and open-minded. They kind of go okay with it, and they say that, they would be happy to have a lovely son instead of a lovely daughter, and that they love their child no matter what. However, as it turns out, Bethany is not transgender. She's a transhuman, which means, in her words, that she would like to cease her bodily engagement and have her mind downloaded as information, as data. And this turn of events, of course, is not so reassuringly met by her parents, that turn out to not be that open-minded as they thought they were. So this show actually came into the world right in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when there was lots of uncertainty in the world. And this show actually offers lots and lots of other rather wild predictions towards our future, some of which are now becoming reality, in some way or another. Well, what is so thrilling and maybe awakening, and why I'm using, this illustration, is, about the show, is exactly this. Our world is changing so rapidly, and it is becoming really difficult for us to fully grasp and understand both new vistas that are ahead of us and the risks that are ahead of us. So this is exactly what the New Now program tries to tune into with. So coming back to transhumanism, what is transhumanism? Before I turn it over to our speakers, I thought it might be a good idea to let us hear from Dr. Nick Bostrom, who is the director of the Future of Humanity Institute at the Oxford University in the UK, and he's one of the most important and famous proponents of transhumanism currently. So he says, I'm going to quote this: "Transhumanists view human nature as a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remote and desirable ways. Current humanity need not be the end point of evolution. Transhumanists hope that by responsible use of science, technology, and other rational means, we shall eventually manage to become posthuman, beings with vastly greater capacities than present human beings have." So broadly speaking, transhuman is a global movement that seeks to achieve radical enhancement of humans' both physical and intellectual capacity, as well as to improve the average human life and probably also pave the way for immortality. Now, following the arrival of all of the ultra-modern technologies, such as genetic engineering, nanotechnologies, body-embedded technologies, and the rise of artificial intelligence, the world of future that was so vividly described in all of the sci-fi novels and films, and by futurist visionaries, a world populated by radically enhanced humans and run by greater than human intelligence, has ceased to be stuff of sci-fi only, or probably just seems that it has ceased to be. Philosophers and anthropologists warn about the risks that are likely to arise in the wake of deploying such technology that might range from wide-ranging control over human behavior to complete manipulation of human thought and wishes, and the disappearance of traditional human values. So today we are talking about this movement and its current agenda, so where we are currently in the transhumanist agenda, as well as about the ethics of human enhancement and the human frontier and where it lies. And it is my absolute delight to be introducing our speakers today. So first of all, Dr. James Hughes. Dr. James Hughes is a bioethicist and sociologist and serves as the Associate Provost for Institutional Research, Assessment and Planning for the University of Massachusetts in Boston. In 2005, Dr. Hughes co-founded the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies with Nick Bostrom, and since then has served as its executive director. He was also the first director of the World Transhumanist Association. Dr. Hughes is author of Citizen Cyborg, Why Democratic Societies Must Respond to the Redesigned Human of the Future, and is co-editor of Surviving the Machine Age, Intelligent Technology and the Transformation of Human Work. James Hughes is a frequent speaker on medical ethics, healthcare policy, and future studies, and he speaks worldwide. Good morning, James. Welcome to the panel. Thanks so much for joining us. Also today we have Dr. Eric Schwitzgebel, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. Most of Eric's research explores connection between empirical philosophy and philosophy of mind, that it's going to be central for our conversation today, especially the nature of belief, the inaccuracy of our judgments about our stream of conscious experience, and the relationship between philosophical ethics and actual moral behavior. Eric's most recent book is A Theory of Jerks and Other Philosophical Misadventures. Eric also works on classical Chinese philosophy and philosophical science fiction. His other books include Perplexities of Consciousness and Describing Inner Experience, Proponent Meets Skeptic. Eric blogs at The Splintered Mind on the reflections on philosophy and psychology. Good morning, Eric.
Morning. Nice to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. It's a pleasure. And we also have with us today Timothy Morton. Hello, Timothy. Timothy is Rita Shih Guffey Chair in English at Rice University. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. So Timothy has written quite a lot of books, and by the way, most of them have been already translated into Russian, so you will find all of them in the list of supplemental materials on our Russian page of the program. So among the books are Hyper Subjects on Becoming Human, All Art is Ecological, Spacecraft, Being Ecological, Humankind on Solidarity with Non-Human People, Dark Ecology, For a Logic of Future Coexistence, Nothing, 3 Inquiries in Buddhism, Hyper-Objects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World, Realist Magic, Objects, Ontology, Casuality, The Ecological Thought, and Ecology Without Nature, Rethinking Environmental Aesthetics, and I'm pretty sure there are more books that Timothy has written on philosophy, ecology, literature, arts, architecture, and design. Well, I'd say that Timothy is one of the most influential intellectuals of today, and is widely known for their concepts of the Anthropocene crisis, the modern human world, the dark ecology, the hyper-objects, and the end of the world as we know it. This is probably something we might be very interested in today. Hello, Timothy. So glad you're here.
Hi, it's an honor to be here.
Thanks so much. So let's start. Let's start with what is transhumanism and what is its agenda of today. I was thinking that maybe we could start with James Hughes, since James, you are very active in working with transhumanism. Maybe you could give us, in just 3 to 5 minutes, a very brief history of transhumanism and where it tends to go nowadays. So what do we need to know about transhumanism?
I usually start the story of transhumanism with our ability to think symbolically, which started, 50, 100,000 years ago, something like that. And I think as soon as we started to have that ability, we probably started to imagine what it would be like to have bodies without disease and have societies without hunger and war, to imagine radically better possibilities. And some of those possibilities we put mythologically into our past and that we've devolved from them. And some of them we put into our after death that we hope to be able to get back to these kinds of limitless bodies, communion with God, transcendental wisdom, and those kinds of things. And then to skip ahead to about 400 years ago, people began to argue that science and reason could produce technologies which would allow us to achieve these things, as opposed to using the mythological, magical, religious technologies that we had proposed before. Now, that gives short shrift to the development of pre-Enlightenment science, and we can talk about that. But since the Enlightenment, there have been people who have argued for bio-utopian possibilities. Condorcet arguing that we would eventually defeat death along with tyranny. People like early Marxist-Leninists, JBS Haldane, J.D. Bernal, J.D. Bernal, one of the first people to propose the possibility of cyborgs, JBS Haldane, who proposed the in vitro fertilization and genetic engineering of a sort. And these were sort of early 20th century transhumanists who began to give us these imaginings of what it might be like to have a radical bio-utopian future. In the 1980s and 90s, this became gelled into what we now call transhumanism, variety of reasons why it's called that. But one is the idea that we're in a transhuman period of history where we're transcending the limitations of the human body. And the other is that we want to create a future in which humans and posthumans, whatever they might be, could coexist. So transhumanism is now a philosophy that we will be able to. A lot of people don't believe in the possibility of transcending human limitations, but there will be technologies which allow us to do that, and that people should have a right to use them. Now, it's not a philosophy that says everyone should use them, because most transhumanists are liberal in the sense of allowing people to figure out whether they should use them or not. But it is a philosophy that says people should be allowed to use them as long as they're not harming others. And then we get into the questions of how to assess that. But that's, today, there are transhumanists in every country. They span religious and secular, they span political tendencies of many different kinds. And there are tiny transhumanist organizations in different places. But I really see transhumanism as more of an ideological tendency that encompasses in the industrialized world maybe 10 to 20% of the population.
Right, thank you. And James, could you just elaborate just a little bit on the latest technologies in use? I mean, we do not need to go too far into the technological side, but just for me and our audiences to get an understanding what is happening or what has happened.
Well, the years and years person that you quoted, that was a focus on uploading, which is certainly a central part of the contemporary transhumanist imagination. The idea that brain-computer interfaces will allow us to record and augment the brain and eventually upload our personality into more secure platforms. But transhumanism encompasses, at its most broad and popular level, the idea of radical longevity, extending human lifespan beyond 80 years or whatever, the elimination of disease, artificial organs, genetic engineering. There are many different technologies, nanomedicine, the ability to introduce small machines into the body. And then more broadly, the transhumanist milieu is one that is engaged with many questions of technology policy. So there are aspects of the transhumanist community interested in space and geoengineering and all kinds of other projects that are not strictly human enhancement, but are kind of derivative of the philosophical questions around human enhancement.
Right. So, but coming back to the mind transfer or mind uploading, or I don't know, brain to computer, linking brain to computer. Do you think there is actually technological potential in there? Might this become reality?
Well, we're already doing it, and we've been doing it for decades. There has been research in putting computer chips into the brains and motor cortex of people who have severe paralysis, and that's been going on for decades. And now with Neuralink, but also other firms that are working on more pins, more smaller devices, miniaturization, and also the artificial intelligence required to communicate between a machine and the brain. We're making rapid advances in this area, and I'll just refer people to the term neural dust as one of the possibilities, the idea that tiny little receivers that don't require a power source could be sprinkled throughout the brain, and then we could communicate with the brain through those. So all of these are already being tried, and Neuralink might be ready for consumer use within a year or so. We'll see.
So you're saying this might become consumer technologies?
I'm quite certain it will be very soon. Consumer, I mean, I think we have to go through a lot of hoops, and necessarily so, to ensure the safety and efficacy of these technologies. So it'll be a while before healthy people will be able to convince a doctor to open up their skull and put anything in it. But the people who have severe paralysis or epilepsy, already there are hundreds of thousands of people who have deep brain stimulating devices to treat tremors and epilepsy. We have consumer devices that send electrical currents or magnetic waves through the brain to enhance or suppress different kinds of functions. So, and those are already consumer devices. So yes, we will have consumer brain-computer interfaces inside the brain within the decade, certainly.
Right, so just to structure a little bit, so there is biological augmentation of humans, and then there is the rise of artificial intelligence. And also I came across this new term that was new to me. It is called moral enhancement. Is it something of the, very state of the art, something very completely new to transhumanist agenda? So where does what is moral enhancement, and where does it fit within the transhumanist agenda?
Actually, I think moral enhancement is an older idea in the transhumanist milieu. If you go back to, for instance, Julian Huxley's coining of the term in the 1950s, very central to his concerns about what it might mean to transcend humanism, is what his concern was at the time, by using new technologies. One of the technologies that he wanted us to explore was the use of psychology to transcend our current human psychological limits. But moral enhancement is the idea that since all moral sentiments and cognition and behavior stems from the brain, and we increasingly understand the moral neuroscience, the different parts of the brain, the neurochemistry, the kinds of functions that lead to different kinds of moral behaviors, caring for other people, evaluating social interactions, being fair, not biased. All of these things happen in the brain, and therefore can be influenced by drugs and devices that influence the brain. And so the question of moral enhancement is how and when should we use such things? Are they actually effective? And what kinds of personalities do we want to be? I mean, I've been arguing in the moral enhancement literature that there are many different virtues that need to be enhanced, not just caring for other people. If you ramp up any one virtue, it becomes a vice. So they all have to be balanced with each other, but that's a longer conversation.
Right, so you know what comes to my mind immediately when you talk about moral enhancement or any other kind of biological enhancement or connecting to AI is actually who's in control and who decides what to enhance and who should be enhanced and in what ways. So actually we are coming to the next step in our discussion, which is the ethics of transhumanism, and I think that's something that's been widely discussed online and within all the scientific communities. So maybe James, again, we'll start with you, and then we will continue the discussion with Eric and Timothy. So the ethics. So who decides and who's in control?
Well, it kind of depends on which transhumanists you talk to, because there is a wide political diversity among transhumanists, from kind of anarchists and libertarians to people like myself, who's a fairly traditional social democrat. I believe that our existing regulatory bodies, in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, for instance, are adequate to the task of assessing almost all of the enhancement modalities that we're talking about, genetic engineering and brain-computer interfaces and so forth. And that, of course, the question of who controls it is, in general, that there should be consent, that people should be able to understand the consequences of using the technology and be free to use or refuse or take out and stop using any of these technologies. Now, the edge cases that I think are quite important are criminal rehabilitation, psychiatric treatment. There are certainly cases where we might use some of these new technologies for purposes that would not be considered voluntary. But from speaking in Russia, the idea of involuntary application of psychiatric treatment is a very sensitive topic, and rightly so. So I think there are very important questions at the edges, but in general, people should be able to decide to use it or not.
Thank you, James. Maybe we could now turn it over to Timothy. So Timothy, if you could, talk a little bit in these directions, right? So about the risks and balanced against the benefits and the ethics of, moral or body enhancement.
Well, let me reiterate that it's a great honor to be here, and indeed I've been looking forward to having this kind of conversation for about 2 decades. So thank you very much for having me. James said it. This is an idea that's been long in the making, and as such, it is actually one of the oldest ideas ever. It's not really about the future. It's about repeating the past. What are you repeating here? In particular, it's the idea that human beings are special and different. Special and different from what? Different from every other life form in the biosphere with which they share a body and a brain, as was said. This idea in its current state, which includes, neoliberal capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, is what is responsible for munching the biosphere down to nothing. I do believe in the future. I think the future should be different from the past. Just look around you. I think that means we have to drop this idea that human beings are special and different.
Thank you, Timothy. So dropping the idea that human beings are special and different, it all comes, I believe, from the Enlightenment period when humans were put in the center of the creation, and that they were also put. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It was kind of philosophically formalized by some white guys in that period, but actually for about 12,000 years has been this idea of separating human beings from most other life forms. We're just living in version 9.0 of that reality. It's the most efficient version yet. And so with great efficiency, we are now about to find out whether we prefer living in the past, which is going to munch the biosphere down to nothing, or actually create a future which will be genuinely creative. Now, not for 1 second am I saying that looking after your brain and caring for your body and not repeating the mistakes of the past are a bad idea. Pretty much in every other iteration of so-called civilization, I would have been executed for my gender and some of the ideas in my head. So I'm not a primitivist in any way. I think we're alienated from the future. And one of the things that's stopping us is the very idea of progress. That human beings have defined themselves as capable of transcending their material conditions forever. It's the plot of every tragedy, after all, to watch somebody trying to do that and then inevitably fall back into the web of fate. And kind of, we've been telling ourselves this, you know, that it's kind of inevitable that we have to do this to ourselves and therefore actually to other life forms, right? Because we're made of other life forms and we coexist with other life forms symbiotically and we're evolution products. So yeah, for example, the server power required to, you know, sustain my life, so-called, in a more permanent way, is at least right now would be responsible for a huge amount of fossil fuel emissions. Just look at what cryptocurrency is doing. I don't think that 300 years in the future, people are going to be going, I mean, imagine the cryogenic suspension chamber opens and maybe some dry ice comes out and there's Ray Kurzweil, who doesn't want to die. And I don't think they'll be going, oh my God, it's Ray. Thank goodness he survived. I think we've been in survival mode for way too long, and survival means damn the torpedoes. It doesn't matter who gets in the way. We need to start living, not surviving.
Thank you, Timothy. But isn't the idea of progress, you know, is very like super central to the transhumanist movement, James? Isn't it like based entirely on the idea of progress?
Yes, it's certainly about progress. But you know, just to respond to Timothy, I think there's some eco-Gaian or there are some green transhumanist ideas that people may not be familiar with. And one is that it's clear that we want people to think in longer term future, and the longer they live, the more likely they are to think about the long-term future. That's precisely one of the reasons why transhumanists tend to get very fixated on questions about catastrophic and existential risks, because we're very concerned that if we live for another 100 years and you know, climate crisis means that we're going to be up to our knees in water, that we might want to take care of that problem. Now, not all transhumanists are fixated on fixing problems because they think technology will inevitably do that. And if you look back at the history of Malthusian predictions for the last 400 years, it's turned out that we've been able to stay ahead of Malthus by inventing new technologies. So I think there is a kind of tug of war there between techno-optimism and certainty that the future will always be better versus our anxieties about catastrophic risks. But at any rate, I don't think it's at all a given that the Human Enhancement Project is anti-green or anti-ecological, or even that it denies the rights of other animals. I mean, David Pierce and George Dvorsky have proposed ways of re-engineering the ecosystem so that we could reduce predation, for instance, get the lion to lie down with the lamb. So I think some of us have quite ecological imaginations around these things.
Thank you. So James, you've just mentioned the existential risks, and that some of the transhumanists are very concerned and working with this with potential existential risk that new technologies might bring to humanity. So Eric, so over to you. As I mentioned in the very beginning, the rise of artificial intelligence is at the core of transhumanism, one of its key agendas. So there is the so-called aligned and unaligned artificial intelligence, and so could you elaborate a little bit on from your point of view as a philosopher of mind, because you're working a lot with human consciousness, human mind. How do human mind and human consciousness can actually coexist with this AI that might one day quite soon become what is called greater than human intelligence, and how they will be coexisting?
Yes. I think the moral risks are quite extreme, and that we need to be super careful about that. And maybe I'll start by reacting to a little bit of what you and James were talking about with the issue of who decides and being sure that any kind of enhancement would be voluntary. And then we can get into the AI case in particular. But something can look voluntary from the outside or from a certain perspective and not really be voluntary. So let me invite you to think about, for example, if we have technologies that enhance people's ability to focus intensely on their work and to reduce the amount of sleep they need and to prioritize, say, productivity in their jobs over their social lives or love relationships, then who are going to be the professors at Stanford? They're going to be the ones who choose all that and crank that up, because they're going to be the ones who are publishing many great papers and making research breakthroughs. And those of us who choose to have a more balanced approach to their lives will not get jobs at Stanford. Or who will be hired by Starbucks, right? To go to the other end of the social scale, right? As long as there are more people who seek jobs than there are jobs available, employers will, unless there's substantial regulation, have the opportunity to choose people who themselves choose to, say, change their emotional interests so that they're happy to put on the pretty smile for all their customers and are focused at work and are happy to work long hours and are happy to be great employees, right? And they'll be the ones that Starbucks hires over those who have more moderate choices. So something that looks voluntary. Yes.
Yes, sorry, Eric. I just wanted to mention the, while you were speaking, you know, the Aldous Huxleys, the alphas, the betas, and the deltas, they immediately come to mind. So it's pretty much what you're describing now.
That's right. So I think that we should not be too quick to go to, well, it'll be voluntary, no one will be forced to do this, so it'll be fine, to that there won't be the kinds of problems that we normally think of when we think of the problems of involuntary personal change or personal enhancement. So that's one thing that I just want to toss in there. I mean, I think there are answers to that. I'm not saying this is a decisive objection to enhancement and the transhumanist vision, but I do think it's something to take very seriously that maybe is not obvious on a first pass think through these issues. And I mean, we can react to that, or I can talk a little bit more about the AI case in particular, which is what you had led your question with. But I did want to get that, at least that first thing in about voluntariness.
Yeah, please continue with the AI, and then we'll come back to voluntarily and involuntary enhancements.
Yeah. So one of the things that is a huge issue in philosophy of mind and the science of consciousness is what are the necessary or sufficient conditions for an entity to have conscious experiences like we have, right? So there's something it's like to be you, as philosophers will say. You have experiences, there's a stream of emotions you have, there's a kind of self-knowledge you have of yourself as a being living in the world, you have visual experiences, you have imagery, all that kind of good stuff, right? Philosophers and scientists call this consciousness. And a big question, huge debate, is what is necessary, what is sufficient for being an entity that has conscious experiences. And I think one of the likely issues we will face with AI development is the creation of entities about whom it's disputable whether they really have conscious experiences like we do, or whether they are mere empty machines, right? So we have fairly good speech production technology now. GPT-3, for example, can produce strings of speech that seem very human-like. It's not going to be very far down the road where we can have fairly realistic emotional expressions on a robot's face, right? So imagine this. Imagine a kind of a mall patrolling robot, right? And it can emit speech in reaction to speech inputs. It can say things like, "Hey, how are you? Oh, I like that shirt that you bought yesterday," right? If it has a kind of access to memory of people who come through the shopping mall recently, right? It can have emotional expressions. Now, one question could be, right, is this like an early 21st century computer souped up, which we normally think does not have consciousness like ours, that is worth treating as morally similar to that of a human being? Or at some point, would a machine like this, a robot like this, be plausibly conscious? What's going to happen, I think, is that people will disagree about this. Both ordinary people and research scientists and philosophers will disagree. And then we will face a big moral choice. Like, what do we do with these entities? Do we treat them really as persons? Or do we not? Do we give them rights similar to ours? Or do we not? Does someone who thinks of herself as trans upload into such a body, right? Some people would say, oh, well, that would be moral equivalent of death or suicide if the entity is not really conscious. Or would that be an enhancement because now she's on a more stable platform and she really is conscious? I suspect that our ability to create things that some people think are conscious and look conscious is going to exceed our capacity to reach a well-justified theoretical consensus about the grounds of consciousness, which will precipitate a huge number of moral dilemmas.
Thank you, Eric. So, Timothy, would you like to add something on consciousness beyond human world? Something to take on from Eric?
Sorry. I'm a big fan of the philosopher Theodor Adorno. He's probably my favorite Marxist philosopher. Why? Because he's so depressing. It's so depressing that it's actually quite soothing. And one of his great essays is called Progress. And in this essay, he says true progress would be when we actually abandon the idea of progress as such, for very similar reasons that I just gave. And that actually, therefore, genuine progress would look to us a little bit like regression. And, the example he gives is of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's watching a horse being whipped and he's crying, and he's not just sympathizing with the horse, he's empathizing with the horse and feeling the pain. And people are thinking probably, oh, what a childish thing to do. It's interesting that the definition of child, which is kind of global at this point, is someone who's allowed to do that kind of thing, even to a supposedly inanimate object, and without being considered weird. But nowadays, of course, we would mostly agree with Nietzsche that was a bad idea to whip that horse. That was very cruel and sadistic. I feel like the issue with AI for me is not so much the AI part in a way. Since we can create AI in a certain sense, I, who's always been just look at my brain. It's a sort of kludge of all kinds of different evolution products, all kind of kludged together. I defy the judge in New York State who's now sitting on a trial about a chimpanzee. This chimpanzee is, some people want to liberate this chimpanzee from a zoo. And the judge is going, well, that's not enough of a self-concept. I don't have any yet, enough proof yet. And the poor scientists, right, they're charged with giving the evidence. And the scientists are unfortunately in belief mode because they never took a humanities class. And they have a belief about belief, which is that belief means hold on very tightly to something. And they go, please believe us. They look at this data, look at this interpretation. And the judge is saying, it's not quite good enough for me. Quick and dirty philosophy solution. Okay, Mr. Judge. Prove to me that you're conscious right now. You have 30 seconds, 29, 28, 27. It's not so much the possibility that I might be an android, because heaven knows there might be, I might not, I don't know, that bothers me. It's the automation. It's the Mickey Mouse broom aspect of so-called AI that bothers me. And one reason why it bothers me is that intelligence, is often thought of as a special bonus prize for being highly evolved. None of the words in that sentence mean anything. There is no highly evolved. Intelligence is not some special thing that special beings have. I think we need to redefine it, and we need to make intelligence and consciousness and a sense of self and all that jazz much, much, much cheaper, so that Beatles can have it, and you don't have to go as far as me, who is a little bit of a panpsychist, who's okay with letting things like pencils have it, right? And black holes can have it. We sort of need to go the other way, I feel. I think the issue again is not so much what you think, it's how you think that starts World War V or whatever it is that we're up to right now. Like you can have different beliefs about belief. You can think believe means hold on tightly, or you can think believe means trust, which is actually much more of a scientific one, right? Like Pfizer is 95% effective. It's better than saying it is effective, damn it. And if you don't agree, I'm going to torture you until you do agree with me. That's medieval true. Modern true is about trusting. Nevertheless, I think that, how we think this idea of intelligence is terribly important. If we think that it's an enhancement or a progress or some kind of step further than other life forms, we are falling into thousands and thousands of years old label in the record store. Now it's got a transhumanist label on top of it, trap, which has basically almost destroyed the planet.
Thanks, Timothy. So, James, to wrap it up a little bit with AI and what we've just been discussing about the existential risk coming from AI, I'm also interested in, and in continuation with Eric and Timothy have just said, is there a teeny tiny possibility that we as humans might be actually in the foreseen future outmatched by the AI that becomes, kind of a smarter entity than we are? And is it an existential risk to humanity? James? I think, James, are you with us? Okay, I think we lost the connection for a second. Eric, maybe you could...
Yeah, I do think there's an existential risk here, right? So what we mean by existential risk would be something like a risk of the extinction of humanity, or a risk of humanity's permanently becoming, falling far short of its potential as a result of some disaster. So one of the things that Nick Bostrom, whom you quoted at the beginning, has really emphasized and is well known for is arguing that super intelligent beings, if we were to set them loose into the world, might not have interests that are aligned very well with ours, and might be able to outcompete and outthink and defeat us if that was their interest. So I think even if there's a small chance of that, I mean, you could argue that's not likely. But even if there's a small chance of that, then I think that could potentially be so catastrophic that we ought to take it very seriously. At the same time, I think the focus on existential risk to us, and here I think maybe I agree with some of the things that Timothy's been saying, is a little bit, puts us too much at the center. Right, because there's also, I think, worth taking just as seriously the possibility that we're not so special that we should see everything through the lens of its impact on us. I think of the relationship between us and some, if we do eventually create some sort of persons, right? The relationship between us and those descendant persons in some ways would be similar to the relationship of a parent and a child. Right, so we shouldn't think of our children in terms necessarily primarily of the risk they pose to us, right? But in terms of their potential. And if they outcompete us, And that might be okay, right? And if we create them in a way that is deliberately focused on making sure that they are subservient to us and adhere to our values and pose no risk to us, then we might be doing a serious moral wrong to them. Because any entity who is a person in the full-blown sense of being capable of independent thought and moral thinking, right, should have liberty to think about and choose their own values. So if we over-constrain the values and potentialities of future persons out of an excessive concern for the risks to us, however that's construed, or humanity in particular, or biological traditional humans in particular, then that would also be a serious moral mistake. And I see we have James back.
So still some tech problems. Timothy, maybe you would like to elaborate a little bit on what Eric has just said
Sure.
in regards to our moral obligations towards our
Yeah, let me just observe for no particular reason that Eric and I have the same screen behind us. This is a most amusing and happy coincidence, especially given Eric's position at the University of California and my lapsed position at the University of California. Yeah, see, the trouble with any subject-object duality, or as Eric's pointing out, a master-servant duality, really. The dualities also include, I think in the bailiwick of sort of active versus passive, or even the binary between masculine and feminine, for example. Any duality like that is based on some kind of master-slave duality, I feel. I'm a big fan of my friend Denise Ferreira de Silva's book, Towards a Global Idea of Race, in which she argues that any subject-object duality, right, is a master-slave duality. Now, if we're treating our body or our brain or mind or whatever like an object, or indeed we're treating other entities like objects, we're creating AIs that can do our bidding, or not, maybe they'll become the masters of us and we'll be the slaves. We're still operating in this basically what is now a pretty much white supremacy idea space, and we haven't really created the future. What we've really done there is we've repeated the past, probably in a more highly automated and therefore more violent way, in the name of surviving. Surviving what? Surviving our embodiment, I feel. And I'm a big fan of John Lennon. There was this argument between Lennon and Neil Young, and Neil Young said, "I'd rather burn out than fade away." And Lennon said, "I'd rather fade away any day." I feel like ecological politics is very much to do with allowing ourselves to fade away, allowing the fact that we are mortal beings, we're finite beings, we can't do everything. And that's actually why we can be kind and helpful and caring. The attempt at omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, whether it's us or some computer software or whatever, is basically just an attempt to make the medieval god real. Nowadays it's called Google. And I feel this concept is, again, it's like an old medieval tweet that we don't need to be retweeting right now.
Thank you, Timothy. James, you're back. We've been, wrapping up on the idea of AI and, the existential risks from it, and also our, moral obligations towards it. Maybe you would like to add something. But we can't hear you, James. Maybe you have to turn on your mic or something. We can see you perfectly well, but we can't hear you.
I'll just say I heard him.
Oh.
But now I don't.
Okay, so I would just kindly ask our tech team to, to do something about it, because I can't be of much help from where I am now. So, yeah, James, can you? Okay, it's only me who cannot hear James. So Alexander, once again, could you please do something about the sound?
Right, so I guess we don't know whether the audience can hear James because the host cannot, but the other speakers can. So maybe we should hold off until we're confident that everyone can hear James.
Let's do that. So let us then again come to the question, on who's in control, because as far as I am concerned, there really might be room for discrimination. And when I've been doing my research on this topic, I've kind of invented two terms that I would like to share with you. Those terms are, when we have those augmented or enhanced humans, there can be like two types of humans, like free-willed augmented humans versus servile augmented humans. I'm not sure if my translation from Russian is something that makes sense. Free-willed versus servile, or as Timothy has mentioned, like free-willed and slaves. So what is actually the line between healing or between therapy and upgrading and enhancing and augmenting towards the point where we can become those free-willed augmented humans and the others are servile ones? James, maybe we could do another try. Okay, so Eric or Timothy, would you like to start?
I could hear him again, but I guess you couldn't. So I will say that one way of thinking about the line between therapy and enhancement is in thinking of in terms of what is the range of normal or typical ability, which of course is a hugely complicated, politically and normatively loaded question, right? But normally you would think that therapy would be applied to someone who falls below what's considered normal or typical, with the aim of getting them into the range of normal or typical, whereas enhancement would be something that's targeted to getting them above that range. And I suspect that the ethics and the politics of that will be very different. It's much politically easier and much more ethically justifiable at a first pass to dedicate resources toward therapy than it is toward enhancement.
The line seems quite vague,
Right, but where that line is,
again, who decides?
Yeah, right.
Timothy, maybe over to you.
Sure. Free will is overrated. Again, it's a kind of a medieval tweet, when you intend to do something, you're already doing it. We know this now from neuroscience. If you've ever been in a band, you'll know that acting actually is much more like listening than it is like cutting into the void. So you're listening to your instrument and you're listening to the music and you're listening to your musical lineage and you're listening to the other players and you're attending to. When you drive, right, you're following directives from the street and the road and the other cars in the traffic. And again, this binary between active and passive it's the binarity in a way of it that's the toxic quality. And if anything, I'd like to soften this idea of act, and I'd also like to sharpen up this idea of passive. Now, actually, I'm a recipient of 25 years of psychoanalysis, can you tell? And I'm now doing EMDR therapy, which is very good. They're both very physically embodied things, and they're both very much related to the brain, actually. And I think there's a certain neuroscientific way I feel that the basic tool of psychoanalysis works, aka free association. It's some kind of neurological lubricant. What are we lubricating, really? We're lubricating the possibility that the future can be different from the past. We're not necessarily becoming normal or more than normal or less than normal or anything like that. We're simply allowing ourselves to become unfrozen so we don't repeat the patterns of the past. And, I'm a great accidental repeater of the patterns of the past, aren't we all? As a collective right now on this planet, we are required to not repeat the patterns of the past. And so things such as therapy or grief work, or indeed art in general, which is like just allowing things to be different for a minute, literally just sort of creating a different kind of reality, are the kinds of things that we need, because what we need is a genuinely future. We don't want to be building the past out over an abyss anymore. That's not really the future. That's just building the past out over the abyss. What we really need is to invite the possibility that things can be different. I think things can be different, especially in terms of life forms. You know, genetic mutation is random, and there appear to be plenty of quantum theoretical things happening in life forms, which implies that at least in a certain part of the universe, things can be different because life slightly reverses entropy. Trying to live longer actually would increase entropy, because you'd be sucking the energy from somewhere in order to do that. And by energy, what we really mean is some kind of abstract word for, you know, other life forms that live on this planet.
Oh my.
Hello, James. Yes.
Can I make a quick comment about artificial
Perfectly,
intelligence?
please do. Yeah, we are very happy you're back. Perfectly.
So artificial intelligence, I think for me, it starts with the question of whether you believe in a supernatural essence to human consciousness. If you believe that human consciousness is a material phenomenon that happens inside the head or inside the body in general, then it is something that eventually we will be able to replicate. Whether we will be replicating it shortly is an important question. I don't think we will, because there's a lot going on there. But eventually we will replicate what happens inside the head. And as we do, we'll also be taking apart our misconceptions about what happens inside our head. The idea that we have a continuous, discrete personality and a self, those kinds of things are already falling by the wayside. So I think eventually we will have full artificial general intelligence. And I think there are legitimate things to be worried about it. But we already have aspects of this kinds of intelligence in the world today that we should be worried about. I mean, governments and corporations are a form of embodied intelligence that already pose threats to our well-being. So there are many ways that we need to regulate the future of artificial intelligence and the present, and the various things that are kind of proxies for artificial intelligence today. In terms of whether we'll be more servile in the future, I do not see this as a terribly interesting question. The idea that current humans shape future humans is, of course, just a given. Whenever you decide to have children and what you decide to teach them and how you decide to structure their life choices, you're structuring the future generation. If you have as your impulse the idea that you want to give your children the best possible future, then you want them to be as intelligent and perhaps as self-controlled, able to control their own behavior, to have lots of human abilities and longevity and health. And that's what most parents would want for their children. If there are parents who decide to put a chip in their children's head to make sure that they can never be anything but Christian, then yes, I'm opposed to that kind of a future. I don't think we should have a future in which our children and our descendants' choices are constrained in a significant way. Most of the things that we talk about in the human enhancement domain are being imagined as a way to expand human choices and possibilities, not as a way to constrain them.
Can I react to that? I mean, I think one really important thing here is children rebel from their parents, right? So parents will normally want more control over their children than it's really healthy for them to have, right? So of course, chip to ensure that they adhere to the parents' religion would be one potential type of example of that, right? But I'm thinking more generally of what we sometimes call tiger moms, right? The idea that you want your child to, really excel in academia or music, right? It's, I think, good that parents cannot over control their teenage children and the make too many choices in advance for their teenage children. One of the risks of increased control from one generation to the next is that over control that stifles the independence, the creativity of the free choice of the next generation.
That's an interesting point, James.
Do you think tiger moms should be outlawed?
I'm not saying they should be outlawed, but I do think that's a big moral dilemma and a big moral issue that we will have to face as our capacities to control the next generation get stronger. I don't have the solution to that problem, but I do want to very much highlight that problem because I think it can sometimes get underplayed in the, I think, correct enthusiasm for the potential if we do manage to enhance and control ourselves.
I just think it's interesting to reflect on the fact that that's one of the anxieties that many people express, the idea of over-controlling our children. But at the same time, people express the anxiety that values may be changing so quickly that we won't recognize the values of our children. We either have the option of allowing our children to come up with their own values or determining what those values should be ahead of time. And I think we should probably allow them to come up more or less with their own values. But I think if, to get back to your point about informal moral coercion of people having to adopt human enhancement because everybody else is doing it, there's an informal moral coercion to be literate, to be able to read. Because if you can't do that today, which is a fairly novel ability in human beings, and if you can't do that today, it's really hard to get employed and to make a living and to just do lots of things. And so, yes, there's a certain stigma to not being able to read. We make it obligatory that every child should be given the opportunity to learn to read. And I'm sure that there are going to be technological enhancements in the future, which are in the same category of universally beneficial and not controversial, that everyone should have access to this, and most parents will want their kids to be able to do them in the same category as literacy.
Yeah, so I would just like to step in again, James, and have another try on this question that is of special interest to me, and I hope for the audience as well. So, how do you envisage this? Who might be in control of all of this? And if this cognitive enhancement might actually be evenly distributed at all?
Well, if you're concerned about the equal distribution of things, which I am as a good socialist, I want everyone to have equal access to things. There are lots of things that people don't have equal access to. And I think we should do our best to make sure that everyone has equal access to them. Right now, vaccines around the world, we do not have equal access to vaccines, and we should. The things that I imagine are human enhancement are things that most people will want access to, or many. And I think most people will want everyone to have equal access to human enhancement. And so the bigger the benefit of a human enhancement technology, the more the pressure will be to ensure that everyone has access to it. So for instance, life extending and disease reducing technologies, we call that medicine. In most countries, the question of basic medicine being available to everyone is a question of national policy, that you create a national health insurance system. In the United States, we still don't have one, but we should. And if we had one, it would be the same question as in other countries. If you have a cognitive enhancement drug or you have a life-extending drug, and should it be available to everyone through that system or not? It should, if it's safe and relatively inexpensive and doesn't create a lot of social disruption. And I don't think most of the human enhancement technologies we're talking about will do that. Now, uploading yourself to the cloud will be of a different order of ensuring universal access. And any technology that creates a significant power differential between citizens, I think, should be in a different category. So that's why we have laws against citizens owning tanks, because if your neighbor has a tank, it's probably bad for the neighborhood. And if your neighbor has cognitive enhancement that gives them a million IQ and they become Lex Luthor and take over the world, that's bad for the rest of us. But most of the things that we're talking about are adding a decade or two to life, adding a couple IQ points, adding more ability to control your moral behavior. These are not things that are existential threats to society.
James, Timothy, anything to add here or?
Gosh, so many things to add, so little time. Let's have a think. Well, you know, some people, again, I'm going to argue that the definition of person needs to be made a lot cheaper, and that a person isn't some kind of special being that is exempt from being biologically embodied. You know, so some people are bonobos, some people are butterflies, some people are whales, some people are dolphins, and we need to make our decisions with regard to the equality, equal access, or however we want to put it, of all people. And I too, as a socialist, believe that if we strictly keep on with this idea that we're just doing things to ourselves, then I feel like we're in for the same kind of trouble that we've been in for the last, you know, couple of thousand years, getting much worse, of course, in the last couple of hundred years with the introduction of fossil fuels, and getting really, really much worse after 1945. In a way, the big question is the notion of technology when seen as a kind of, just a kind of thing over there that we can talk about. Like, here's technology, and here are dolphins, and here are humans, and here's social space. What are you going to do with technology? It's kind of saying, like, how are we going to do things efficiently, right? Like, just to kind of boil it down to the notion of efficiency, right? And let's be more efficient, right? Let's do things that cause us to do what we're doing already, only more efficient. Let's enhance. Now, efficiency for its own sake, I've been trying to define evil for some time, and I think that's a pretty good definition of evil. We all already live inside an AI. If Karl Marx had had access to the phrase adaptive AI and machine learn, he could have put Capital Volume 1 on a fortune cookie. He could have said, capitalism is an adaptive AI that machine learns how to extract life from the biosphere without stopping. The question is, do we like that? And is there going to be a biosphere left if we just let it do its thing without stopping? So again, you know, it's not so much like that. It's not about technology. It's like how you think these things is what, you know, is what creates a lot of pain and misery.
Could you articulate why you think human enhancement's a threat to the biosphere?
Again, I'm not going to be drawn into an argument about this or that enhancement. I'm talking about how we think these things. I'm thinking in terms of, if we abstract the notion of technology or whatever, just as a thing in itself, we're really talking in a kind of record store that isn't really about reality. It's about a sort of label, right? Like, do you think if we do more heavy metal, then, you know, hip hop will be changed for the better? I don't know. I don't know what heavy metal is. I only just joined this band. I'm a musician. I don't know. And so kind of, it's a little bit like, you know, it's a question of thinking very carefully what we mean by the word technology. To an ant, a leaf is technology, right? To a tree, a leaf is technology. To a tree, some kind of bark beetle is a kind of technology, maybe sometimes that it doesn't want. Nevertheless, right, so what we're dealing with here is how things do things to other things, yeah? But these are things, right? We're doing things to things. These things also are sort of there, they exist, whether or not we do things to them. That is what I claim as an adherent of a thing called object-oriented ontology. And, you know, if we're only going to be concerned with what Aristotle calls the efficient cause of things, rather than the material cause, or why are we doing it? You know, like, it doesn't really matter what the cup is made of. It could be made of human flesh or styrofoam or whatever. As long as it looks like a cup and quacks like a cup, then it's a cup, right? That's what we've been doing to other life forms for the last however long. And we're soon going to find out whether it's any good for us, let alone for them.
Could I ask you about what you said about persons at the beginning, which loops into what you were just saying? I'm curious how radical your view is, right?
Well,
so the way
yeah.
that let me frame my question, and then you can answer it, right? So the way that kind of most Anglophone philosophers use person is to refer to the entity, the type of entity that warrants the highest level of moral concern. Right. So there's a debate about whether apes are persons, right, in the sense that when do they deserve the highest level of moral concern, similar to what humans deserve, right? To say a butterfly is a person is much more radical even than to say an ape is a person, right? So if there were, say, a car accident and you've got a butterfly here and you've got a human being here, right? If you think they're both persons, are you committed to saying that you kind of approximately indifferent between saving the butterfly versus saving the human, or do human beings warrant some kind of more concern than butterflies? So that's what I was wondering, what your view is on that.
Beautifully put. People, there's a few people like me who used to say things. I hope they don't say this anymore, but they say something like, the AIDS virus is just as much right to exist as a human being with AIDS. Right, this is clearly a horrifying thing to say. What I'm saying is that we're at liberty to make a political choice. Are we going to include butterflies in our social space considerations or not? I have a cat. The previous cat got run over. I consider this cat to be an outside cat. Of course, from the cat's point of view, this is not the outside. This is Iraq for cats. There are these things called roads and these things called cars, which were not designed with cats in mind. Ecological politics is inevitably hypocritical because you're going to be missing out at least one entity in your calculation. And, because very trivially, if you're going to be nice to bunny rabbits, it means you're not going to be nice to bunny rabbit predators. So you're never going to get it absolutely right. And given that I would rather characterize everything as people rather than as objects or machines, because that has still a whiff of they're manipulable in some way, and that's okay. Then we are, unfortunately, in a sort of existential void where we have to make grown-up choices about who we're going to affiliate with and who we aren't. Are we going to let the AIDS virus carry on living, or are we going to let people with AIDS carry on living, right? It's a political choice, and it has nothing to do with some concept of ontology, right? This is like, so these things are objects. These things are people. If we define people that way, then soon we're into, a kind of uncanny valley in between where there's like subhuman, inhuman, all these reasons why the thing over there appears to be cute and different from me, like R2-D2 or Hitler's dog Blondie, is because I've conveniently forgotten about all these other beings because basically I'm, one is cleaving to anti-Semitism or some kind of white supremacy there to say that there's a sort of like a gold standard of healthy human being, implies actually that there are sort of subhuman or inhuman beings. So Turing basically blew up the idea that person means something special and different, right? The Turing test, the computing machinery and artificial intelligence, basically defines a person very minimally as not a non-person. In other words, if you can't prove that I'm not an android, then I might as well be a person. So included in the concept of person is a little bit of paranoia. Right, like heaven knows, I could be some kind of AI right now. Even I can't check that. And so part of empathy, however, is actually paranoia. The more suspicious you are of somebody or something, but they may or may not be an android, the more you care about them. This is the basic plot of Blade Runner. So I think I'm on the side of defining everything as people, but making the concept of person extremely cheap and highly ambiguous. And again, it's not about being, special or high up or different. Butterflies aren't lower down. There is no lower down and higher up in evolution because genetic mutation is random with respect to current need. And if you were to wind the tape back and play it forwards again, you'd come up with totally different life forms.
Tim, if I could just respond quickly. I think most transhumanists, and myself included, subscribe to some version of Peter Singerian personhood theory. The idea that there is such a thing as a person, at least the illusion of personhood, the idea that you are a self with intents and purposes over time, that you are limited to one body currently, and that those are the kinds of things that should have highest value in our moral code. And so we reject the deep ecological view, which I take it that Tim is articulating, the notion of a kind of fuzzing up of the values of things. And yes, in the abstract, I think most transhumanists would trade persons for non-persons in terms of value. However, we also add to that substrate independence, the idea that you don't have to be a person based in carbon gook in your head. It could be silicon, it could be something else. And so personhood theory is very central to the transhumanist project.
Yes, you've made my point. Peter Singh is fine with executing disabled people, and I'm not.
Some humans are not persons because they've lost the cognitive capacity to be a person, and some persons are not humans, like great apes.
That is brilliantly put. Thank you,
Said it.
James. Yeah. Can I just kind of take our conversation a little bit away, because there is the last discussion block that I really would love us to spend some time on, and we have some 15 to 20 minutes left. So as far as I understand, and James, please correct me if I'm wrong, so transhumanists view death as a kind of a technical failure that can be and must be prevented. So being unable to actually face death and kind of try to take evolution into our own hands, does it make us any less human? So coming to the human frontier part of our discussion, so we're kind of in the process of creation new meaning for ourselves. That begins with, with us being not able to face death. So a question to James, whom I do not see now on the screen, or maybe Eric, will start with you. So the human frontier, and where is this line, this frontier that, that separates us humans and our human, traditional established human values from what's beyond? Can we call it posthuman or whatever?
I mean, one of the ways of thinking about this issue, or one of the ways of coming into this issue, is to think about what it is to be a human and what it is to be a person. And right, I would agree with James about not all persons are humans. I think the converse of that, not all humans are persons, is much more tricky, and I don't agree with Peter Singer about some of those things, as Timothy pointed out. Right, but right, the idea that we could create persons, or that in the next several centuries maybe there will be persons who are radically different from humans understood as a certain kind of biological species, I think that's a fascinating and wonderful idea. It could be an amazingly awesome future. You started off by asking about death, and I guess I'm inclined to the unradical view that death is bad. So I think Timothy will disagree about this, right? But if there were a way to forestall death for a long time, maybe even achieve immortality, although if you think literal infinitude, that might be a little much to even comprehend. But if there were a way to forestall death for a long time without terrible costs in other ways, I think that would probably be a good thing. And I think we have James back again, so he was the intended target of this question.
Oh my goodness. What was the question again?
You've missed it. So the question was, about this transhumanism trying to kind of revert death. So prevent death, as a technical failure. So the question is, where does it leave us as humans? And Eric has just, described a very perfect, idyllic scenario of the future,
Well,
one of the idyllic scenarios. I'm just wondering, where does it leave it without traditional human values? Will they still be in the picture? Will we still be willing to cling to our values, or will they be changing radically?
Well, I think we can have human values without them hinging on the inevitability of death. But I don't think we're actually proposing in the transhumanist movement the elimination of death. I don't think we're proposing immortality. There are many philosophical questions about what that could even possibly mean. But what we're proposing is an extension of healthy longevity. And in the last century, healthy longevity has already extended by decades. And so if you think that we're the worse off for having life expectancies in the 80s as opposed to the 50s or the 60s, then possibly having life expectancy to 120 would be a bad thing. But if you don't think that we're any worse off for being able to live into our 80s, I don't see why we'd be worse off for living into our 120s. Now, if you live to be 5,000 years old, you're probably going to be a very different kind of human being than the ones we have today. You will have had to make decisions that are pretty significant.
Yes.
You lost me?
You're back. I think you're back. Please continue.
No, I think. Let me address while we're getting back. Let me address this idea of clinging to human values, which you raised, whether the values will change. To me, it seems inevitable that the values would radically change if our form of life radically changed. For example, a lot of our values, like the values of equality that James was mentioning, which I also share, the very idea of equality of individuals rests on the notion of an individual, the idea that a person is normally embodied in one body for their whole life, and they don't merge or split, right? But as soon as you have a technology that might allow people to, say, merge and divide at will, suddenly it becomes much more complicated how to think about an issue like individual rights or equality, right? So let's say you had an entity that could, the day before the election, split into 10,000 copies and then vote 10,000 times and then merge back into one, right? That would be a problem for a political system, right? Or someone who could strategically merge or divide in order to collect resources from, say, the unemployment benefits or something like that, right? So when you're talking about radically changing, potentially, the form of life of a person, our ideas of value are going to have to change radically to conform to our different forms of life. And it's, I think, going to be very difficult for us with our current value systems to anticipate very well in advance what those changes of value will look like.
I would just say the problem of having someone split themselves 1 million times to vote is, to me, comparable to the problem of someone using $1 billion to influence an election. So we have problems of ensuring the equality of efficacy between citizens, and that will be true in the future as well.
Timothy.
I'm dieting and exercising right now to prolong my life. I really care about prolonging life. I'd like to prolong coral life, whale life, squirrel life. There are all kinds of amazing, are they people or not, AI-like beings, from the future. They're called life forms. They're here right now. Why don't we try landing on Earth at some point and caring for them? Because we can understand, if you can understand what I'm saying, then you're responsible for it. You don't have to feel guilty, you just have to understand.
James, is it something you would like to comment back?
Well, I'll just say again, I don't understand the necessary connection between caring about the biosphere and longevity. And I've already proposed that if you live a long time, you may care more about the future of the planet and future of society than if you were only going to live a couple decades.
There's plenty of people in Gen Z who are pretty cross with boomers for living very, very long and caring very, very little about the biosphere.
Well, again, I don't know what the connection is between the fact that they live a long time. They screwed up the biosphere when they were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, not when they were in their 80s and 90s. It turns
Use
out that
leaf blowers in my street. Drive a car for 100 miles or use a leaf blower for 20 minutes. It's the same thing.
Senior citizens in the industrialized world use about half of the resources that people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s use. They're less violent. They're more calm about a lot of things. They're less, interventionist in foreign policy. So I think there are lots of advantages to an older society, and one of them will be a society that cares more about long-term projects like ecological restoration.
Do you think that there will be more temptation to extract excess resources from the biosphere to the extent we develop technologies that can do that for self-interested goals, like longevity and feeling happy and those kinds of things, right? Is there a possibility of more temptation there?
Well, I suspect you and I agree that capitalism has a lot to do with the extractive process, and perhaps state capitalism if we include whatever China is. And yes, I do think we need to regulate the hyper-extractive and destructive forms of modern society that don't take account of the externalities of our industrial and consumer processes. That has absolutely nothing, in my mind, to do with whether individuals should be able to live longer or be smarter. If we were all smarter, we might be able to fix some of these problems. I mean, we might not have 40% of America wanting fascism and refusing to wear masks and get vaccinated if people were smarter. The world might be quite a much better place in all the ways that we want. So I don't understand the connection, except in a general hand-wavy sense that human beings are bad, and therefore everything human beings want, like living longer, is a bad thing. I don't understand the connection between that and ecology. I think it'd be better for us all to be smarter, and in that way, probably would be better to the environment.
It's the framing of these things that's really important, isn't it? It's sort of like in the name of living longer, I'm going to be okay with other life forms suffering and dying, is unfortunately the big picture frame of where, white Western human beings have been for the last few hundred years. And, when I go in my supermarket and I see mostly white, mostly boys piling their trolleys full of toilet paper, I'm really sort of seeing a kind of reflexive behavior that is just mimicking the primitive accumulation phase of capitalism. As you so rightly say, it's a big problem we have right now. And that it's how you think, I need to survive, I need to keep going, I need to have a huge wad of toilet paper that'll keep me going for the next few months. And it doesn't matter if that old person can't reach it, I'm going to reach it myself. So it's not so much about humans being good or bad, it's about how we think and how we think these things that could cause a lot of violence. And I would like my prolongation of life, I was born in the hospital where penicillin was discovered, and all the poor working class people who were suddenly able to have penicillin on the National Health Service after the Second World War. My dear old mum tells the story about doctors practically throwing it out of the office, at people who were desperate for it. Wouldn't it be nice if we treated, bunny rabbits the same way?
Eric, maybe we can hear some of your final remarks now.
Right. So I think that it's wonderful that we have a conversation like this, because it is very likely that we will have powerful technologies at our fingertips in the next several decades or a few centuries that will have a transformative effect on human life and life on the planet in general. And it's super important that we have diverse opinions about this, and that we recognize both the risks and the potential benefits of this, rather than cheerleading a little too much for one side or the other. I think that absolutely we need to be having these conversations, and I'm delighted to see that both in academia and in the wider public, people are starting to take these kinds of moral issues about transhumanism and the future seriously.
Thank you, James. your final remarks, or maybe, just some guidance for our audience where to go from here. I don't know what to read, what to listen to, because we gave so much context for them. Okay, so there is no sound again. I'm sorry. Could you?
He was recommending the website for the Institute of Ethics and Technology that he runs.
Yes, we have it on the list of all materials.
IEET.org.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Right now I'm reading Toby Ord's wonderful book Precipice, which I think anyone who's interested in existential risk would probably be interested in, so I'd recommend that.
Timothy, what about you? Any guidance to our audience? Where to go from here?
The attempt to transcend your physical embodiment only serves to drill down further into it in the long run. The future is very, very different from the past. The actual future is the possibility that things can be different, whereas the past is just the stuff that's already happened, that some of which is still repeating. Right now, we have a choice, very, very simply, between the past and the future. And I believe that it's important for us to maintain the possibility that things can be different. One of the things that we are, that is very toxic to this idea is the notion that human beings are special and different. Not good or evil, but special and different. Or maybe they're evil and different and special, or maybe they're good and different and special, but basically we're the main show in town. And then once we figured out, how to enhance ourselves, we'll get around to the business of caring for other life forms, either chronologically or logically. It's sort of that way around. That's the structure that I would like to not exist.
Thank you, Timothy. So I think I'm going to wrap our discussion up. So thank you very much once again for taking the time to be with us tonight, or it's 9:30 in St. Petersburg and Russia. Thank you for all of your insights that actually gave some brilliant context to think further for our audiences. And I would just like to remind our audiences that you can follow James Hughes' work on the website of Institute of Ethics and Emerging Technologies. It's down there in the list of supplemental materials on the New Now page. And then you can follow Eric. He blogs at The Splintered Mind. And of course, you can follow Timothy. He tweets. They tweet at Eco Thought, and Timothy is also on Instagram. So thank you very much once again for taking the time. Unfortunately, we didn't have too much time for doing the Q&A, but the audience feedback seemed really, really impressive. There were not so many questions as comments, and I would be happy to send them over to you in the next coming days if you're interested. So thanks so much.
Thank you to Eric and Tim for picking up my slack. I was incommunicado.
Thank you all. And just a little announcement for me to make. Please stay tuned with the New Now by Manesh program. Our next discussion will be centered around the theme of body and identity, and is coming end of January. The website, newnow.manesh.com, and we're on Manesh Instagram as well. So have a lovely afternoon and good night to everyone in Russia. Thank you. Bye.